a very warm welcome to this public lecture, which is an event that is sponsored by the Systemic Risk Center as well as the LSE Law School. And we have had a wonderful conference all day about an institutional theory of the firm. And this event is the grand finale. So this is the public lecture by Katharina Pistor. And in the field that we are talking about, she can be rightfully called a superstar. So she is the superstar in corporate governance, corporate law, financial law, and I'm very, very happy that she was able to come to this today. And with a view to introducing her, she's a professor at Columbia Law School, and the title of her chair is the Edwin B. Parker Professor of Corporate Law at Columbia Law School. And the first time I heard her speak many, many years ago was in Vienna, and she was flown in to talk to some students, postgraduate people, and postdoc people about law and economics and what that was. And that was an eye-opener, because until then, I just thought there existed law and there existed economics, and how the two could possibly be combined was a complete mystery. So at that point, I was very junior. She was not quite as junior. And that was, but still very junior. But that was the first time I heard her speak, and it was a fascinating presentation. And if I was to divide up the work she has done so far, I would sort of divide this up in three phases. So phase one would be a phase where she used her background in civil law, combined it with her grounding in the common law, and contributed to law and economics scholarship using that comparative background. And then the next phase then is to extend this to the discussion of emerging economies and the situation after the Soviet Union collapsed and all these states were emerging. And I think we spoke earlier, she says at that point she learned how law and economics work together as sort of a foundation for a society and for an economy. So this is sort of a phase where law and economics are combined. And I think the most recent work I would describe as putting the law into the economics. So reversing this discussion and talking about law not being a function of economic forces, but rather being something that works together and shapes economic forces. And it's in this spirit, in this new phase of her work, that we will hear from her today. I should also say, and the people from the conference will find this very reassuring, we have checked, no fire alarm is going to go off. Because what happened this morning at the conference is a fire alarm went off, but we were, of course, extremely committed people. So one of us, Karian, had to do her presentation in the park because we were not losing time. And I think that's sort of is going to go down the legend, the hall of legend at LSE. Anyway, so over to Katharina, who is going to give her presentation on financializing the non-financial firm.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for your endurance to stay after a very long and extremely interesting day. I just had to laugh when you were reminding me of my period when I discussed the role of law in the transformation of the former socialist world. Alex Neuber, who was a student with me at the Kennedy School of Government, will remember that I think it was in 1993, in the spring of 1993, I had a heated shouting match with Jeff Sachs in a seminar we both attended about the importance of law for economic reforms. So there's always a tension between the two fields, and trying to understand how they relate to one another is of great importance. I think what I will say today, the bottom line is that maybe there is a little bit too much law in business or in the firm, and in a particular perversion of the law, but I will come back to this later. So what I want to think about is the relationship between the corporate form and the firm. The activities of the firm as an economic entity, and the role that the corporate form and other legal forms might play in that context, or have come to play. I think this business-legal interaction, of course, business is evolving over time, so is the role of law, so is law itself. Law has been changed a lot, corporate law has been changed a lot over the decades, and I think I will try to point out some really critical legal changes that have made possible what I call the financialization of firms. Other people, of course, have talked about financialization before, but I think critical legal changes, other facilitating legal changes that we have to understand. But I think they have gone so far that we can also use the law to strip the business of business. That will be the bottom line. So I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between form and the firm and the legal form. Talk about the rationale for maybe having complete unity of the legal form and the business itself. Many of us today discuss that actually, of course, we understand also as economists that the large business forms are legal persons, but they're very often not only one legal person, but they can be hundreds of legal persons at the same time. And that's basically where what I call legal fragmentation. So I want to ask for the rationale, about the rationale for legal fragmentation, and talk a little bit about the critical legal conditions for having legal fragmentation. Then I will argue that legal fragmentation is a critical element in the financialization of business more generally, and then say a few words about what we've seen in history about similar constellations, and maybe that helps us to think about the future as well. So first on firm and legal form, firms of course are business organizations, and they started before we had a corporate form. They organize themselves in all kinds of different ways. Josh has written important work on saying actually before the corporation existed in England, there was partnership law that was used to create very similar kind of creatures. John Morley at Yale has made a similar case for trust law as being the quintessential organizational form to organize business before you had corporate law off the shelf. Having corporate law off the shelf, of course, is something that evolved only in the 19th century. First, you could get it by a special decree or special approval, and then at some point you had free incorporation. Starting, I always tell my students, in New York, we had the first Free Incorporation Act in 1811, only for manufacturing companies. But it also had some very interesting features. One of them was we incorporate you only for 20 years, and you can't ever have more than $100,000 in capital. It was a maximum ceiling, not a minimum capital requirement. It tells you something about the fear of the legislatures about what would happen with a corporation, and that they would actually create a Frankenstein monster that they would no longer be able to control. And I would say that's exactly the right intuition if we look back. It took only 200 years or a little less to create these Frankenstein monsters. But even though we think very often, I think very often it's true to say that the legal form is congruent with the business, of course that does not have to be the case. And I think what the question that I want to ask is very different also from the classic question that is asked in the theory of the firm literature, Oliver Hart, Grossman Hart, these folks who have basically asked about the boundaries of the firm. They're basically asking who should control the assets, and if there are two or more asset pools, who amongst the controllers of these different asset pools should control the other asset pool? That's a fundamental question that he asked, and he even got the Nobel Prize for asking and answering the question not only qualitatively but also with mathematical models. So I have no mathematical models to offer here, but the question that I want to ask is how come we see within a single control structure the fragmentation of legal form? What's the purpose of this? What does it do? We might be doing different things at different points in time. I don't think there's ever a single answer for phenomena like that, but I will tell you basically a story, what I think is going on here. So why does a common control structure employ legal fragmentation is the question that I want to ask here. So let's start with a simple idea of the unity of firm and form. There's, of course, the classic arguments why you would want to have a corporate form that has certain types of features. You create a broad capital base. The shareholders are investing in this form. They have limited liability. The company can act then in its own name, contract on its own assets, soon be sued in its own name. These are the core attributes of the corporation. It can raise debt, and it can raise equity. There's also a lot to be said for the unity, because you give shareholders information transparency. They know what this unit is. They have their shares, they get the information, there's the board, there are not multiple levels of companies. It's relatively easy to look through, and so you might have greater certainty about what you actually are getting. You can assess risk and return, you know what the debt level is, you know what you're getting at, and so that has a lot to do, I think, with just clarity, transparency for the investors. There's also, of course, better corporate governance and accountability. If I know that the directors that I vote into office are in charge of this business unit, and I get the information about that business unit, and they can't do easy empire building elsewhere that is somewhat removed from my direct control. So having just the unity makes a lot of sense. And then last but not least, if we think about the entity theory, we could even say that's the perfect fit. It's a perfect fit of thinking the corporation should actually be congruent with the economic entity, and then we can also think about the purpose of corporate law as trying to enhance and mobilize sort of the resources of the business entity, make sure that it can be employed in a meaningful way, that you have shareholders who want to invest in the firm because they're protected by law, and so you could also have dispersed ownership structures, etc., etc. So but the idea is basically there's lots to be said for having complete overlap of the two. You can also say something about fragmentation. I'm just going to give you the standard arguments that are in the literature about why you would want to have fragmentation. You want to perhaps lower the information costs of creditors who want to lend to different subunits of a firm, right? Rather than having to think about all the different activities of a firm, if it does more than one activity, which is what many firms do, then you have perfect information of this one little thing, and you want only to lend to this one little thing, and you know a lot about this one little thing. So Anthony Casey at Chicago, who has developed this argument in his own work, he basically suggests if there's a conglomerate, you own an oil refinery, and you own some hotels. There are creditors who want to lend only against hotels and not against oil refineries, right? And so they specialize. And then on top of that, I'll come back to this later, if they can also then selectively decide whether they want to enforce their creditor rights against the subsidiary, and if they get the parent to guarantee these loans, which they very often do, then they could also threaten with a nuclear bomb, saying we might also go after the parent and we could bring down the entire group. So they have options to enforce against different elements of the company. That's the rationale that he gives for the phenomenon of corporate webs that he describes, which I think is very close to what Sarah Patterson was talking about today, even in a more high-powered fashion, but I'll come back to those issues. Then, of course, there's the classic argument, you have a holding company, and then you have all these subsidiaries that do different operations. They might do this in different countries, in different jurisdictions. What does the holding company do? It's all about strategy, corporate strategy for all these multiple entities, and then you have specialized entities. You set them up for each of these special operations. You may want to take advantage of the corporate veil for doing this, because you are separating the assets behind that veil from those of the holding, and the holding holds, of course, only as assets the shares in other corporations. And that goes together, of course, with the famous argument that Hansman and Krugman made when they asked, why do we need the state for corporate law? Why can't we just have a contractual device? They came up with this notion that it's all about asset shielding or asset petitioning. It's only because the state sanctions that we can tell creditors, you don't have access to the firm's assets just because you have a contract against the firm's owner, right? So you shield the assets of the firm against the personal creditors of the owner, and by the way, against the owner as well, who may not be able, by law, just by shareholder rights, to take out his own assets again. Once you commit them through the corporation, once you have a corporation, that's where the assets are. So once, with the asset shielding argument, you basically say risk diversification, separation of these different asset pools, separating some pools from different types of creditors. You can even make an efficiency argument out of that if you want. And then, of course, there's a slightly more darker story. You use these asset shielding devices in the different corporate entities for tax shielding purposes, tax evasion, if you want, or avoidance at least, and regulatory arbitrage. You set up an entity in a different jurisdiction where you get better tax treatment. You set it up in a jurisdiction where you have lower labor cost, etc. And of course, that is also a big driver of subsidiarization of the corporate form. So in the literature on legal fragmentation, you see, of course, a big literature on corporate groups, especially in Europe, very much in Germany, other countries that have groups. Germany has an entire group law, of course, as part of the corporate law that people have talked about. I myself was a co-author together with Klaus Haupt and many others years and years ago when I worked at the Max Planck Institute, which is when I also went to Vienna to see Eva and her colleagues there. We talked about company group law and what are the costs and benefits of having company group law. Here the idea still being these are basically part of the same entity, just organized into different legal forms. And then the question is, how do you allocate rights and responsibilities between these different entities and the parent? One of the doctrines that was debated a lot during this time was the French Rosenblum doctrine, which basically said if the parent basically exposes a subsidiary to certain risks, it might have to be liable for anything that happens with the company. So you can't hide behind the shield under all circumstances. There is something like veil piercing that can happen then inside the group at a lower threshold than it might otherwise be. Anyway, so there is a whole body of legal literature that deals with company groups and how to govern them. Under German law, you also have contractually created company groups. It doesn't have to be through ownership, but you might have very similar legal results if you have a long-standing relationship that you have protected in contractual law as well. Then, of course, there's another big debate about pyramid structures, where you basically use shareholder control to control the top of the pyramid and control then through the pyramid almost all of the operations, but with relatively limited equity exposure. So the separation of equity ownership and control, also the separation of the risk that comes with equity ownership and control is part of the big pyramid literature. And then there's the more recent literature, I think, in response to what we've seen happening the last several decades, but increasingly, I think, since the global financial crisis of 2008, which is what Anthony Casey has called the new corporate web, where we see tailored entity partitioning primarily for purposes of financialization. And here in particular, his argument that this allows creditors to lend in a tailored fashion to particular sub-entities, but then also to enforce selectively against different entities of an entire group. That comes into the discussion here. So if we think about the business literature, of course, there has also been a debate about organization of companies, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in legal form, right? You can have subdivisions in the so-called M form of a business, where you have, because of operational issues, you just organize your company internally into different divisions, and they might have different managers. And sometimes people say this is much more efficient to have that, at least under certain circumstances, than a U form. So papers have been written in economics about the costs and benefits of M and U form organization. This may or may not be supported by legal structure. You could have an M form organization within a single legal entity, but you can also do this basically and have a different subsidiary for each of these organizations. And again, there might be reasons to do that because you want to raise capital separately, especially debt capital if the parent holds all the equity here, and take advantage of the asset shielding purposes. It might also be a very good acquisition strategy. If you do mergers and acquisition, you buy a new firm, you maintain it as a subsidiary, so you can protect yourself against the potential liabilities that you couldn't anticipate when you bought the firm. And so you first, before you do a full merger, you might keep the entity as a subsidiary. But behind that simple structure here, you could also have the kind of financialization through debt contracts by basically saying, well, we have maybe actually the same kind of operations. We do certain things, especially in financial entities. We produce new types of financial assets, but we package everyone into a different legal form, even though they have all the same management, the same offices, the same location. They might also, however, be maybe incorporated in different jurisdictions, so we can combine legal arbitrage with the asset shielding and levering up these firms, and thereby producing profits, which will, inside the firm, be handed back to the parent and from the parent to the shareholders. This is the pyramid structure, just to, as a visualization. I talked about this before. You have a controller who owns sort of the parent 100%, and that parent just owns the next level at 50% plus 1, and the 50% plus 1, 50% plus 1. So you can see I have effective control over the entire structure, but I'm not exposed to the entire economic risk that I share with my minority shareholders. They face that risk, and in classic pyramid structures like in Italy, there's also empirical evidence that suggests that there is a discount to the share price of minorities because they know it's a controller somewhere in the back, right? So this is, I think, in this framework, there has been a lot of debate about what I call legal fragmentation. They didn't call it this. They basically look specifically at pyramid structure. I think here the game is about equity control, and the spreading or dissemination of risk, shifting of risk to others. What has happened on a much larger scale over the last couple of decades is what Casey calls the evolution of the corporate web. I think it has accelerated since the global financial crisis. In effect, I would say the legal techniques that were developed for creating asset-backed securitization, mortgage-backed securitization, the entire structured finance model that crashed in 2008, that brought us the shadow banking system that migrated to the balance sheet of non-financial companies. That's where I see the financialization of non-financial firms. That's basically what has happened over the last 13 years on a much larger scale. We see predecessors to that, but I think that is happening here. So you have on the left hand of this slide, you have basically a fully legally integrated firm. That's P. It has assets A and B. It's all within the same corporate form, with corporate veil, if we want to call it this, the corporate shell. And it then borrows from a bank, and the bank has a claim against the firm. Very simple, right? And that's sort of full integration. And then on the other side, you have basically using the parent that then has assets which are separately incorporated in different legal entities. And here are just two. A and B are now separate entities, not part of the same legal form. Now we have three corporations, the parent, A and B. Parent owns 100% in each A and B. And then they go out, A and B are going out to raise debt finance, right? And they raise debt finance, maybe even the parent raises debt finance itself from a bank and ask then A or B to guarantee the loan from the bank. And when A and B go out either to the bank or to other creditors, and now we're talking about all kinds of other non-bank creditors in the shadow banking system that give credits, they will then get a guarantee for that debt either from the other company or from the parent company. So you're creating basically different asset pools so that you can guarantee or collateralize each other's loans and create additional separate pools that give at least the impression that there are more assets around that you could collateralize. In the banking literature, in particular the banking group literature, one of my doctoral students, Biljana Biljanovska, has written a very nice dissertation where she shows how in European banking groups you have a practice that she and others have called double leverage or triple leverage. The parent raises debt finance, then capitalizes a subsidiary, so that's equity, and that equity is again used to raise additional debt for that subsidiary, and that debt is pushed down as equity into the next subsidiary. And unless you have a very robust consolidated accounting rules system, and it is not always robust, not to all, with respect to all potential creditors here or all configurations, you might miss this even if you ask for consolidated accounts by the bank on the very top. And that's basically, I think, what's happening here increasingly with the non-financial firms, that you see that you can increase your overall leverage by carving out different asset pools and using cross guarantees to raise more funds, which then of course have to be either paid back or refinanced at some point. And that brings us for the corporate sector into the same kind of mechanism that I think Hyman Minsky very well described for the financial sector more generally, that you start with relatively stable credit finance or debt finance by financing only projects that will give you the returns that you expect. Hedge finance, he calls this. Then through competitive pressure, you get into speculative finance. You think maybe not everything will be producing the right return at the right time, but some of these projects might be refinanced if it doesn't work out. And from there, the next step is what he calls then Ponzi finances. If most people think most of the time that most of the debt will have to be refinanced. And just again, making another hint, I think, to Sarah's presentation today, when you have then covenant-light debts, or basically no strings attached to these debts, they're relatively easy to refinance. And that's, of course, in the interest of almost everybody who participates, because nobody wants the system to blow up. It's not sustainable over the long term, but I think it can be sustained for quite some time. And the beauty of it, from the perspective of the parent, in particular the parent shareholders, so as long as this works, the parent shareholders can make very high returns. So all the profits that the subsidiaries are making are being pushed back to the parent. That was the model of Lehman Brothers. There was no profit left at the entity subsidiary level, all pushed back to the parent company, paid out to shareholders in dividends, repurchase programs, and they could come back and take more. So what is financialization? Just to conceptualize the empirical evidence a little bit, Greta Krippner, a sociologist, while she was still writing her dissertation, she called it in a paper a pattern of accumulation in which profits accrue primarily through financial channels rather than through trade and commodity production. So we're creating profit increasingly through financial channels, not through the production as such. And I think the legal toolkit that we're using, and corporate law plays an important role in this legal toolkit, in the coding of capital, as I called it in my previous book, facilitates the financialization of the firm as such. A very astute observation Flickstein made already, and he even related this to a much earlier phenomenon. It started already with the big conglomerates in the United States in the 1960s, accelerated in the 1980s, and I think we got the full-blown system today. He basically says we have seen a transformation of the firm as an entity manufacturing and selling products to a collection of assets earning different rates of return. If you then can package these assets with the help of the corporate form into different legal forms and use them to finance them differently, control them differently, then you have the perfect setup for financialization, to basically extract the financial returns what you do in terms of production, selling goods, etc., becomes completely secondary. Now, at some point you can say, well, how can this work? This is like, it is a Ponzi scheme. It is a Ponzi scheme. But Ponzi schemes can work for quite some time, especially if most people think that there's still something to be had here. Another point I would say that, and that's at least shown in the evidence that Casey brings to the table as well, very often extreme versions of this happen in distressed firms that are bought out by equity funds who just basically set up these structures to extract additional returns, and eventually the company might go under, but you could still have extracted quite a bit of money in this fashion from these firms. Another way of putting this, also a nice paper by Samuel Nafo and Dutta, who look into the conglomerate structure in the United States in the 1960s. I'll come back to this in a second as well, who basically, I would call this financialization. They describe this as playing capital markets in order to leverage firm operations. So use the firm, leverage them up, use the capital markets. It's another definition of the shadow banking system, right? This is how Perry Merling and others have called the shadow banking system. You use basically the capital market finance to funding to invest in firms or in bank operations. That's what shadow banking is all about. And in my own work, I've basically shown, of course, in the Code of Capital, how you can clone legal persons. And in a follow-up paper, I've basically made the point that the value of law, the title is The Value of Law, is not only an ideational value, but law itself can be monetized. Law itself becomes the very source from which we can extract value. And of course, this is obvious with things like patents and other intellectual property rights. It's also obvious, I think, for financial assets because they're also legal constructs. But we can even use the corporate form in that way as well. So the powers of legal fragmentation is what what you can do in double or triple leveraging. You're just pushing down debt as equity into the next firm that can be used then to raise additional debt. There is an interesting empirical literature that focuses on what they call pyramids. The data are older than the phenomenon that I talk about, but I think it has parallels to what I'm talking about here, where Paligorova and Chu showed for data in Europe that in pyramid structures, we see strong evidence for expropriating assets from the subsidiaries. So it's clear that this goes all back to the parent company and the controller behind, and that the subsidiaries are vehicles that themselves become the objects of extraction rather than true firm operations. And in a way, I think you could say the parent company then is nothing but an ATM machine for the shareholders. They can go back and they get the repurchase program. So if you think about the big debate over the last 10, 15 years, especially in the United States, the amount of money that has been paid back to shareholders, that's the ATM mechanism, right? You extract the value, pay it out, because there's no sense and there's no strategy really to reinvest. At the same time, we have less investment in R&D, secular stagnation. Even Larry Summers has recognized that. So I think that could be all interpreted as part of a similar picture. And of course, that doesn't bode so well for productivity, innovation, and the firm as such in the future. Now, all of this couldn't have happened with the corporation or the corporate form as it was originally created. So if I give my students when I give my students the statute from 1811 of the state of New York, you basically have 1.5 pages, and you have very, very clear prescriptions. First of all, the directors all have to be shareholders. You can't take outsiders. I mentioned already you will be incorporated only for 20 years. And then we'll look again at basically a sunset provision, a ceiling for capital, and other, like what I call funny provisions when I talk to my students. I always ask them to try to imagine an economy that had retained these features. Of course, these features went away in no time, because in the US, since corporate law is at the state level, it just took another state to have a set of different provisions, the migration of companies to the state, plus courts that said, under the Commerce Clause, the first state has to recognize the legal form of another state. So the portability of the legal form across boundaries is something that facilitates this. So I think this is an important issue, but I would say this is facilitating. The sine qua non for doing what I describe as the financialization of the corporation is first that you allow a corporation to hold shares in another corporation. Otherwise, this would be difficult, not entirely impossible. You can also use trusts, of course. So if at least the corporation can be use the trust form in a similar way without necessarily being considered as an owner of a corporation, you could do a lot of this stuff. But I think the shift from natural persons being the owners, the shareholders of the corporation, to saying corporations can own other corporations was important. In Europe, part of the basic structure since the beginning of the 19th century. In the US, it took until the late 19th century to allow this, and this was the major move that New Jersey made after the US antitrust statute. The Sherman Act was enacted in 1890. In 1892, New Jersey had a book on the law on the books that said all the big trust companies can come to us and basically create holding structures. So you have a holding structure that owns the shares, and the other participants of these antitrust arrangements, and you could basically set the price internally inside this holding structure, and you were not violating the antitrust rules. So they all migrated to New Jersey, and then Delaware eventually got into the game and made it even more interesting for managers to be there. And so you could evade not only federal law, but also constraints in different states by finding the best state of incorporation. But owning corporations, owning other corporations is critical. And the other critical issue is that courts have respected the corporate form almost no matter what. So we mentioned piercing today. It doesn't happen very often. In the US, empirical evidence suggests that piercing is much less likely when there is another corporation behind the subsidiary than if there is a natural person. Somewhat counterintuitive, I think, but you can see that there's a very strong bias to maintain the corporate form sometimes broken through in tax by tax authorities that consolidate and look through abuses of a shell company in a tax paradise. But by and large, we respect the corporate form no matter what you do it. You don't have to have employees. You can have the same board that every other corporation in that jurisdiction the Cayman Island has. Everybody knows that the only purpose for this corporation to exist is some regulatory or tax arbitrage, and yet we still respect the corporate form. I've said elsewhere that we should not, but that's one of the conditions for the kind of, I think, legal fragmentation that gives us financialization of the firms that we have seen. On top of that, I think if you then also have corporate mobility, you can pick and choose your jurisdiction, and you have limited, if no veil piercing, so you can't get through the corporate form to either the parent or the shareholders behind. And on top of that, of course, that we get in Delaware and other states in the United States is very nimble dividend rules. You can pay out almost everything that you can in. So in Delaware, you can take out you can profits, but it can also be sort of past profits that you can pay out in dividends. And then for repurchase programs, they also have been liberalized. As what used to be much more restrictive, that you can repurchase your shares, and but that has gone with the wind as well. So I think these are important legal changes. They're not the only ones. We can talk about more, but the ability to just use the corporate form as a vehicle to do all kinds of transactional stuff with them, whether or not there is a separate business, requires some adaptation in the original idea of the corporate form. In that sense, I think, yes, that you can think of it as an entity theory as it was originally conceived, but with a handful of strategic changes that happened over time, it becomes simply as a vehicle that can be used for multiple purposes. I discussed this a little bit in my book, The Code of Capital, how legal persons have been cloned. I discussed the case of Lehman Brothers. And just to give you a sense of the scale of this, and it's not the largest one, Lehman had at least 200 officially registered subsidiaries. People estimate it probably had thousands of other separate vehicles, very often trusts and other vehicles, through which these different financial papers and instruments that it created were created and channeled. And the setup was basically that the holding company in the United States, also incorporated in Delaware, just should say, it's not that you have to be necessarily multiple jurisdiction, that's why you incorporate. In the state of Delaware alone, Lehman had 60 subsidiaries. In the UK, it had 34, and another 30 plus in the Cayman Islands. So you can see this is just a multiplication of the corporate form for specific types of purposes. And when you look a little closer, you find that these entities would raise funds, debt finance for certain activities, would get a guarantee typically from the parent. So the parent waives its limited liability vis-a-vis these subsidiaries, which looks for the creditors as if they actually are fine, right? They got a guarantee from the parent, so that's going to be fine. But the only assets that the parent holds are the shares in all the subsidiaries. All the profits are being channeled back to the shareholders. So that basically gives you the Ponzi structure. We're taking the profits and paying it out to the shareholders. That, I think, is sort of the model of what Lehman did and other investment banks that did all the same thing prior to the crisis, that has been transposed to the balance sheets of ordinary corporations increasingly. Not all of them, again, I think very often in times of crisis. So what I would like to say now is that this is an extreme version of something that has happened earlier, and you can trace it back in history. But I think we also have to be mindful that this extreme version that exists now might very likely blow up in our face. I think it will, because this is basically the entire shadow banking system is tied to these structures. If a couple of corporations go under, you will see a chain reaction, right? The big banks might play a role. They probably refinance some of the exposure that other shadow banking activities and entities have to that. So I'm not going to make a prediction about who's going to go under or when they're going to go under, but with interest rates going up now and economic uncertainty increasing, I have little doubt that this will come to a more dramatic end relatively soon. But the basic idea for using the corporate form as a vehicle for what I would call financialization, you've seen already in the 1960s. Flickstein said as much. NAFO, in his paper that I mentioned before, basically says the conglomerates, even the term conglomerates in the 1960s was used for this, not so much for just buying all kinds of operational businesses and building these big business empires. That is how it's very often being portrayed. In fact, they also used these acquisitions to lever up and to increase shareholder return in this fashion. And another interesting point he makes, so the two authors in this paper make, is that very often non-business insiders, so this is not the same business sector that is investing, buying a firm, but this is very often financial acquirers, so buying these firms and building these conglomerates around themselves that are engaging in these practices. So of course we see something very similar in the leveraged buyouts of the 1980s. Works always a little bit differently, but in the leveraged buyout you basically take out on a lot of debt and then you make the assets of the companies that you acquire, use them as a collateral effectively to pay back that debt. And then I think we see increasingly the equity funds and corporate restructuring in the 2000s already, I think on a much larger scale in the non-financial corporate world in the 2000s. And evidence for how this ends, the best evidence, because the problem is, of course, we very often don't really know. You have to have inside channels to talk to lawyers, to talk to these firms. Because most of these contracts, of course, are private. You just don't know exactly what they're doing. You can indirectly look into the financials of the firm, but you would need very good consolidated accounts of the parent company to understand what's happening in the subsidiaries, and that's difficult to look through. You can look through once the company goes into bankruptcy, right? So Casey, in his study of this new corporate web, he looks at the big corporate bankruptcies of Kodak, Dana Corporation, Calpine, Residential Capital, Toyas appears there. And then in the COVID crisis, when Hertz car rental went under, even the Financial Times was reporting this, how Hertz had been reorganized, restructured with equity funds to basically create this internal asset minting machine, I would call it, or financialization machine. It emerged again from bankruptcy, but it had basically used its car fleet only as sort of the back end of a business operation that was increasingly dealing in financial assets. Okay, so what we see, of course, what I just want to say is that this is not entirely new, but you perfect these mechanisms and you transpose them and reinvent them in different contexts. But I think the tendency has been, because if you can make money easy, you don't make money hard, in a hard way. Sort of the temptation to make money in an easy way by exploiting these structures is pretty big. Just by this background piece of evidence, and I'm just saying correlation, I'm not saying causation, but the leverage or the business borrowing by US corporates has soared enormously since the 1950s, right? So there's a lot of debt finance, and it really runs counter to many of the models we learned, at least my generation learned when we first tried to understand the difference between the common law and the civil law systems and the continental European capital structures and those of Anglo-Saxon firms. The mantra was always these companies are equity finance, they go to the capital markets and they have some background debt finance, and then the companies in Europe, they get the big loans from the universal banks, and that's so much more important. But the amount of debt finance, I think, in the US, and of course we need comparative data to draw real conclusions, is stunning and has increased and accelerated again after the financial crisis. Let me just close basically by talking a little bit about another historical predecessor, if you wish, and that's before the corporate form. Just to make the point, it's not only about the corporate form, but it's about the ability to use legal constructs and persuade judges that they should uphold something that you might have only in contract and not fully sanctioned by a corporate form that would be sanctioned by state law. So Henry Hansman and Rainier Krugman talk about this in their work on asset petitioning, but there's even, I think, somewhat more interesting work by John Paget and his co-authors who looked at the emergence of long-distance banking in Florence after a political revolution, where you had the combination, sort of in this political moment, bankers and traders found themselves and created the foundations for, basically used long-distance trading practices to begin long-distance financial practices, and helped support them through family relations. You would send your son-in-law to the offices in Brussels to support this. But the legal structure is nonetheless really interesting, and Hansman and Krugman also talk about this. This is what they called, or Paget called, the partnership system. A system whereby the Medici in Florence, they were the senior partners, and then they would set up a separate partnership in each of the trading hubs where they operated. And they were all separate partnerships, but bound by contract to the senior partnership. They had to send their reports. They could be recalled. But at the same time, they were trying to argue, and they did very often successfully argue in court, that the financials of the partnership was separate from the parent. So if the partnership in Bruges had a contractual problem, the contracting party could not enforce against the Medici partnership, but had to go to Bruges first, or had to go to London first. So there was a priority rule that courts developed, which is akin to saying there are almost like corporate veils, that you separate these partnerships from one another. That has been described in the literature, and then on top of that, Paget and his co-author found that at that time when they started building this system, these partnership systems, and other entities, other organizations copied that, credit soared in Florence and in Italy, in Tuscany during that time. And they explain this basically in a very similar way in which Anthony Casey explains the corporate web today, is that by having these different entities, more creditors were willing to lend. They were ultimately getting sort of the credibility because there was a senior partner behind them said, we will stand in for that. So what they show is that all Florentine businesses were highly leveraged at the time, that the senior partners increasingly became not so much business people for industry-specific performances, but they became cross-industry financiers, as our equity funds do and others do as well. And because credit was the lifeblood and increasingly became the lifeblood of the Florentine business, they had enormous power over people because they could give them business, give them credit, or withhold both from them. So it's a different episode, a different earlier historical context, and a different legal form. The point here is that financialization as such, of course, is an older story. And I think what is important for us sort of to think about when we think about the firm, what does the firm really do? What is its purpose? How important is what we think the business operation, the trading of cloth? Or how important is the financial business that the firm does? And of course, we know nowadays that Apple and others are big shadow banks, right? And so we just have to put this back into our theories. So what are then the lessons for an institutional theory of the firm? That's the topic of this entire symposium, and I couldn't be here yesterday because I had to teach, but I've really enjoyed the day today and learned a lot from that. And many of the things I'm saying in this slide, many of the things that I said before have been said today, so this is nothing really new. But let's just recall again sort of that many of the economic theories think that the firm exists as an alternative to the market, where the market is idealized as the best form for organizing business or entrepreneurship, but there must be sometimes hierarchical decision making because the cost of coordination and doing these decisions on the market is too high. That's what Coase essentially said in 1937. You have authority, a hierarchical mode of decision making. To which Grossman and Hart say it's not just the decision making process, actually the control of the assets. That's Marxist, but they basically reiterate this and add a formal model to this and say we're optimizing control rights over assets, and when we then transpose the argument to financial contracts, over future returns. So the whole thing is then who should have control over future financial flows, right? And we optimize that by giving this control to shareholders. And looking at the empirical evidence, at the transformation of businesses, not only the corporate form, it's not only the corporate form that is transformed, but the business itself, I'm basically asking the question, what if giving investors property rights invariably prioritizes legal fragmentation and the financialization or assetization of the corporate form in pursuit of profits over ordinary production? We still have then, I think, an institutional arrangement, right? But the legal institutional arrangements might well dominate the business substance, right? And that raises then the question whether in the end we still have a firm. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Just to say, we're going to have a little bit of a conversation now, and then I'm going to open up the floor for questions. I need to give a warning, this is recorded. So if you ask a question, you'll be recorded as well, and the recording will be made available afterwards through the website of the Systemic Risk Center. So my first question, Katharina, would be, well, first of all, thank you for a fascinating presentation. And I do understand why the shareholders like this. So I can see why Lehman Brothers shareholders would think that's a good idea. Why are the lenders in this? Like, what's in it for them? How can you persuade lenders to part with their money to subsidize the shareholders in that way?
Yeah, I think to understand that, we also have to understand the transformation of the lending market. You know, these are not the old banks, and they're also not subject to prudential rules of banks, so that they would have to make sure that they have capital adequacy requirements and comply with them when they expose themselves to this kind of risk. But it's a much shorter term aggressive lending market by many financial intermediaries that are not regulated by banks, that are set up to not be regulated by banks. And for them, the calculus, I think, has to be is either we go in there in Minskian terms, either for speculative finance or Ponzi finance things. We hope or expect that this loan will be refinanced at the next stage, or we can get out ourselves earlier, which is another way of saying it's going to be refinanced. So this whole thing is that we're not lending for end results to realize a particular investment purpose, but we are lending short term on certain base calculations that we might. What is the likelihood that this thing will blow up in the next 2 or 3 months, or even days or hours? And can we lend overnight? And what is the collateral basis that we can get? If we get collateral from the parent, it looks pretty good to us, right? And so I think it's basically a risk calculus under conditions of uncertainty, but it's a risk calculus that for short-term lenders that are running around with too much capital, that they also have to park somewhere, right? You have to put your money somewhere. You don't want to keep it. You can't keep too much money in a bank account. Insurance covers only so much. So you're trying to find short-term investment opportunities that give you some return, or at least sort of protect the money for a little while. And I think under those conditions, it's not so surprising that lots of lenders basically invest in these structures.
Yeah. Now, so this is what you mean by the shadow banking system. These.
Yeah, no, I think, I don't like to talk about shadow banks. I think the shadow banking system is basically a system of credit relations that uses private law institutions to recreate banking without being regulated by banking. And so it's very much asset-based. Right? So rather than having, but we also have seen the transformation of banking from having issuing notes, the banks, and they were no longer allowed to issue notes, so they create deposits. And now the next round is we don't no longer create deposits, but we do asset-based securitization, asset-based lending, and that can then take many different forms. And I think I would use the term shadow banking or parallel banking for that kind of credit system or money system, some people would call it, that is based on asset backing rather than deposit systems and regulation and backing, explicit backing by the central banks. I think implicit backing we already have for that as well.
So the way I sort of understand what you're saying here is that the law is the source of the problem, and in particular private law is a source of the problem. So, and what then would you change in the private law space to, help?
So I think there are probably more spaces than just the private law. So I think, the historically what you see typically is that you leave the private law intact. It is treated like the sacred cow that nobody touches. And one of the critiques that I also get from private law scholars about my book very often is, why don't you just regulate? Why do we want to touch anything that is in private law? So these are the old institutions that are out there and that haven't, the beauty of them is we can adapt them to changing circumstances, but we do this as lawyers in legal practice, and once in a while we have to get backing from a court for this, but this is basically our toolkit that we play with and we don't touch, right? Sometimes we want to have legal change. If we really need it, we go and lobby for legislative change, like the changes in corporate law that I mentioned. So the typical reaction used to be just get then regulation, but what we also see that regulation erodes relatively fast. So it's even the New Deal or even trying to refashion capitalism after World War II, within 4 decades at most, we had dismantled the system, or were aggressively dismantling in the 1980s, but you can already see it's starting in the 60s and 70s that the system is being taken apart. So then we have to go back and say, how come these public regulatory regimes are so weak over time? They were quite effective. They did accomplish something for a couple of years, and then systematically they were eroded. And I think there I would go back to the private law, because you can use the toolkit of private law to get around them, provided certain additional mechanisms are in place. And I think we also have to remind ourselves it's not just the toolkit, it's the ability to make this toolkit portable, to get over across jurisdictional boundaries, to convince courts that this too shall be legal, because sometimes you are challenged in court. But that's the dynamic that I see, sort of this dance between trying to cabin a particular abuse of legal resources through regulation, the ability to get around that. To some extent, when you say, what's wrong with private law, to some extent this is inevitable, right? For two reasons, because law is inherently incomplete, and also if you want to have a dynamic market economy, you have to make sure that the law can be adapted to different circumstances in a fairly decentralized fashion. I think that has to be part of the game if that's what you want. The question is how to set up basically a meta level where you say that's too much, and that brings us to the dilemma of when and how can you constrain this, and not only through the public regulation that you can get around with again, but also how to roll back the system that we had created in private law. So, looking at the corporate form, I would be much more relaxed about, let's say, call it piercing the corporate veil, looking through. Mm-hmm. Right? For tax evasion purposes, I see no reason why we respect the corporate form whatsoever. I also don't see a reason why we still respect limited liability for known polluters, given that the evidence that we have. I would strip it, right? And if necessary, through a legislative act. So I think there are features of the corporate form that came about at a certain point in time. They helped certain interests and also had some social benefit that no longer serve us, and I think we should rethink them. Similarly, I think we should rethink how we treat certain claims. Let's say in bankruptcy, there was this big debate about bankruptcy, safe harbors. Of course, there are specific features I think where you can see there were legal changes that were legitimized that put the system in overdrive. And at the very least, I would try to roll them back to get a bit more policy space and to restabilize the system. That won't prevent it from destabilizing again. So this is what Minsky said as well, that these systems inherently destabilize, and I think they inherently erode legal strictures that we put on them. So, and I think in a dynamic system, at some level, this is inevitable. The question is whether we have political institutional mechanisms in place that monitor, catch them, and whether we have the political will and ability to respond to that. And the answer to the last several questions has been no, unfortunately, very often.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm now taking questions, inviting the audience to make contributions, ask a question. So while you are thinking about your question, let me add another one of mine. So we've got post-financial crisis. There was this idea that one way to stop financialization is to help business put themselves into a sort of process of self-reflection where they identify what is their purpose, and then realize that their purpose isn't to make money, their purpose isn't to put in place financial structures, their purpose is to make drugs that help people with health problems, to run hospitals, and so what do you think of that strategy?
I mean, if we could realize it would be a great strategy. I don't really see it. I mean, it depends also, of course, the countries that you're looking at. I'd say when you look at the U.S. health sector and the presence of REITs and equity funds in the U.S. health sector that are using basically the health system to fleece it, frankly, in a similar way, as we have seen in many other sectors, then I don't see like a reflection on that the real purpose of the sector is to provide public health. But the real purpose of the sector, increasingly, and then through structures, again, REITs are real estate investment trusts that were created in the 1960s to give tax subsidies to invest in real estate, right? For funds that would invest in real estate, and not a bad idea. But these things are used today for health in the health sector, in many other sectors for which they were not designed, and are tax subsidized vehicles for financializing entire sectors. And I think that's again where, in theory, the legislature should be on its toes. There have even been articles in the Wall Street Journal. I have a student who worked with people in Congress on these issues. It's just not making headlines. It's not seeing any political responses to it. So I think there is a movement. Of course, now we need to be sustainable. We have to think about the future and have to do and create employment, etc. But I think much of I'm maybe too cynical at this stage, but I think much of what I see is sort of soft talk and what is happening behind that. And sometimes you can also understand if the firm is in distress, and you can either go into bankruptcy or be bought out by an equity fund, you just consider different options. What are the options that you have under certain market conditions? And then you just go in for another ride, whatever the outcome is.
Okay, well, we've got a question from Sarah Patterson.
Thanks, Katharina.
I think we need a mic somehow. Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Katharina. Absolutely fabulous talk. I wonder, we might have expected post-2008 to have a massive conversation about the features you're identifying. It's obviously different, but this idea of fragmentation and financialization, of course, focused on the financial firm, but many of the features that you're talking about, absolutely central to what happened. And so I think what I expected was a massive 1930s style conversation about the system at a really macro level. And it seems to me that didn't happen. We never got close to it happening. And I wonder if you agree, and if you do agree, why you think that was.
I agree with that, and I was, I think, equally shocked that we did not. I think there are a couple of things going on. I think many people only began to understand how the system was configured during the crisis. The immediate reaction was the banks. Also, the banks were, sort of, not the banks, but some of the investment banks, and then, of course, AIG. But here in the UK, also the banks were the first one that really seemed to need a bailout, and much of the regulatory reforms focused on the banking system to make that sound, again, with the idea that this is where the deposits are and where our savers are, etc. And we never really got around then to the harder question of what to do about the system that really was, I think, at fault. And people did talk about shadow banking, parallel banking system, and people sort of drew these wonderful maps about how this all worked. But when you look at the debates at the Financial Stability Board, how shadow banking was defined and what regulatory measures were taken, it's hard to avoid the impression that there was also a lot of lobbying against going too deep. And I think that created then, we didn't even, in the US, you didn't even get sort of to the money market funds, right, which were also right in the middle. They were the lifeblood for the parallel banking system, and they were clearly risky, because otherwise the Fed wouldn't have had to backstop them in the midst of the crisis. And even those creatures, which were obviously at risk, were not fully re-regulated, and we still have the same kind of loopholes, or if you want, in the Investment Act and other provisions that we can set them up and let them run the way they're running. So I think there's probably a lot of, I'm sure there's a lot of lobbying going on, but I think also I think that it took several years after the crisis for policymakers and even academics to get a better sense of how the system really worked, and to think about next time around what to do about it. In the meantime, they were already doing this. And when you talk to the lawyers in practice, they didn't stop their practice. They called what they did CDOs, it's now CLOs, and yes, they're a little bit different, but then this is the same. I mean, like, you build an entire business also as a law firm or as a financial intermediary, and you just find a new application for it, and as long as nobody prevents you from doing it, that's I think what happened. I think another thing that is also hampering us on a massive way in the financial regulation, I think this is also kind of shocking about the hearings in the US right now about the insurrection, is the political apathy about these things. I mean, the lack of deep political engagement with an economic collapse or a political collapse, and I don't really know how to explain this or how to respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question up there. Could you, oh yeah, you can use that mic and give your name and affiliation, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the beautiful speech. So I am a postgraduate law student currently pursuing my master's in law in LSE. And I would like to ask what you believe regarding this political disengagement that you just mentioned. Doesn't Pillar 1 and the whole discussion and agreement on tax evasion due to the digitalization of economy shows and exposes an international political will to actually address those issues? And the second thing I would like to add is, if we have such a big problem with deciding what is a firm and what should it be, and with the financialization of the firm, shouldn't a global consensus be found, maybe through distributive ledger technology? Because that's what comes in my mind right now when I hear about the word consensus. In the past, I just thought about Latin.
Yeah, thank you very much for these questions. So I think there's some hope for international coordination, and I think the OECD principles for international taxation finally, after a century, putting the international tax system on slightly different footing, given that much of the international reach of many companies is no longer physical, right? We had in the 1920s still this idea you have to have a physical footprint, otherwise the state can't tax you. Now we have to find new principles. And I think it's important that we found them. We still made a huge compromise by saying the tax rate is 12%, which is not maybe where we would want it. I would have wanted it to be, but it's better to have new principles, and then we can talk about this too. I would just point to the political economy of even getting to that point, right? Because we wouldn't have gotten there just with the OECD alone. The Trump administration said we don't do this. And then France went out and said, we will tax your big tech companies in France because they're using our customers. And we will collect this tax. And then dozens of other countries said we will do the same thing, each with a different tax rate and different tax strategy, which is when the big tech companies said to the US government, let's go back to the negotiation table. That, in the end, gave us the OECD principles. So what this tells you, the public-private divide is not so easy. Very often in the international realm, the public agents, the governments are working on behalf of their financial sector or their big tech companies or whatever sectors is. They are their agents in the international negotiations. They're not separate from them, which is why we can't have a global political consensus on what to do for the broad public, because that's unfortunately not how the political economy works in that regard. And then the last thing I would say about the DAO and other digital creatures, they can also be used for pure financialization. They're not necessarily good just because they take the form of digits rather than legal structures.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So we've got a question from Josh, and then, one here, please, yes.
Joshua Getzler, Oxford. Tremendous lecture, and thank you for the stimulation you've given the academic community in your work, which we all read and teach. My question is, do we have other world experiments about how to regulate and stop societies vanishing down this financialization hole? Australia, Canada, maybe Germany, did they show some resilience in having a free market system and a financial system, but managed to avoid the fate of Britain and America?
Well, I think during the financial crisis, we saw that Canada remained relatively stable. Also, Australia did to some extent, it's probably not surprising because some of the the banks had been better regulated before, and the shadow banking system had not creeped up quite as much in Canada itself yet. So I think that suggests, of course, that with the right political will, you can keep a tab on that system. Having said that, even in a country like Germany, which is much more difficult to operate also for a shadow banking system, right? Even sort of the whole idea about real estate and mortgages and the registration system and trying to financialize that stuff is incredibly difficult in a civil law system. It was actually also much more complicated in America, but they just did it. And they were found out only exposed that what they did was actually not exactly legal, and we didn't really know who was holding the mortgage, but in Germany it didn't really work. So they had to find alternatives, and they created a foundation and lobbied the legislature to try to facilitate alternative ways of securitization because they couldn't just copy the Anglo-Saxon practice. But what I would say is in a globally competitive financial system, the major economies will be subjected to the pressures to do it as well, because there's just the competition going on. If we don't play with them, we will be left behind, and we just have to reconfigure our legal structures to get there. I think there are some automatic stabilizers in some legal systems because their basic private law structure is less amenable to these games. That is true for civilian system, less so for other common law system. And in those systems, I can only speculate because I don't know them well enough. It must be either regulation or they just don't have enough people who want to play these high stakes pokers quite yet.
Thank you. Great. Yes, please.
Hello. Thank you for the talk again. I'm Michael. So you said something about the easy money versus the hard earlier, and as far as I understand that, it's something like why invest in something difficult when you can fragment, lever up, and then cash out to the shareholders and whoever else. And I'm curious, do you have a view on maybe like the prevalence of profitable investment opportunities, or why exactly is it easier to do this than make something more cleverly or innovate in some sense?
Yeah, it's not that cheap because lawyers make a lot of money doing this, right? And some financial intermediaries as well. I think I can just repeat what I read sometimes. I don't know. I haven't done also the empirical or analytical analysis. One reason people point out is that there are fewer investment opportunities in part because of intellectual property rights, right? When we enclose everything and we have almost everything privatized, what else can you find to invest in, right? So some people explain the dearth of investment opportunity with sort of the scope of patent protection and other copyright protections today. I'm not sure whether it's a full explanation, but I would say it's probably part of it. But on the other hand, we have a lot of investment needs, right? We need green technologies left and right. We need to rebuild the infrastructure. We need to, there's so much that you can potentially do. So I think in my mind, it's probably more the cost calculus of the ease with which you can make relatively quick money, the expectations we have created that shareholders get a certain return. And if you can't produce this, you will be in the doldrums and your share price will tank. So you do whatever to prop up. That's part of it, right? It's not just we just use it as an ATM machine. It's basically the result that I observe after you look at all these mechanisms playing in a particular direction.
Tuli.
Thank you, Tully Rector, Utrecht University. So thank you for the talk. You expressed some puzzlement about why there wasn't more widespread sort of mass political mobilization around these concerns after 2008. In my recollection, there was a lot of public anger about the bank bailouts in 2008, but one explanation, at least, is just that these legal mechanisms of financial power are just forbiddingly complex and Byzantine, and it's very hard to kind of mobilize mass political action. And I'm just wondering if you think that we need, in addition to some of the changes you described, to sort of elaborate new modes of democratic political mobilization and engagement to kind of track and tame some of these, or respond to some of these complexities accordingly, democratically as a populace.
No, of course there was a lot of political anger against the banks in particular. So we found basically our bashing boys and we bashed the banks. But the real culprits might have been the shadow banking system that nobody understood. So this goes together, right? But we also didn't have a systematic attempt to explain to the public what happened. I think the regulators went along with the story the banks were the bad guys. And then they regulated the banks, and the banks complained that they were regulated, but the guys who really did it were not really regulated. It's a slight overstatement, but I think it's not entirely wrong either. So you found your culprits. The public, of course, can't know more than what we are willing to tell them. And we, I think, including academics, but certainly policymakers and legislatures. And so we need more information, but we also know we're in a political moment that the information alone probably won't do the trick. So the question is indeed about more public engagements. It's, I think, indeed about rethinking about the independence of central bank, their isolation from political oversight and accountability. Just sort of this, this big institution that hangs there. It was, in the US at least, designed to actually oversee the banking sector and then was retooled. As my wonderful colleague Lev Menand has recently written about in a book, The Fed Unbound, was retooled by a former Chase banker who became the Fed chair in the 1950s into actually the bank the banker's bank, right? Like the Bank of England has always been the banker's bank. And so we have to rethink the institutions, how we govern them at a much more fundamental level. I don't think it's just education and having a big debate. I agree with that.
Great, thank you. Yes, please. So,
hello. Hi, Professor. Thanks a lot for the amazing presentation. I'm a master's student here at the LSE doing development studies. So I've got two questions, follow-up questions to your previous comments on lobbying and green financing. So my first question is on what do you think we need in order to get out of the lobbying, significant lobbying from financial industry elites, big corps, in order to achieve better legal reforms, as I suppose power significantly shapes laws as well. And my second question is on, would you also see significant Ponzi risk in the exponential rise in ESG investment in recent years? Thank you.
Yeah, so it's both are difficult questions. The first one in particular, because I just don't see that we can fundamentally reset the system without a major crisis, and I don't want a major crisis to happen. So I was actually quite relieved that the central banks rescued us in 2008 and rescued us again in 2020, but I think the longer we keep the system in motion, the bigger the problem will be and the bigger the crash that will probably come eventually. But I think we just should all be aware that if you let the system go under, and it will self-destroy, it was about to self-destroy in September 2008. If the Fed and other central banks had not intervened, you would just have had a massive drop in asset prices and the collapsing of an entire financial system. I think that was pretty clear at the time. You don't know how you will come out at the other end. You know, I'm from Germany. I know how Germany came out at the other end in the 1930s, and the political risk that you face is just phenomenal. I don't think that absent a similar crisis, though, we will get out of the stronghold of finance. I mean, you know, the entire debate. Now we now have the technology with the digital technology, cryptocurrencies. We could actually get rid of the middleman. We could all have an account with the central bank. We could have a completely different financial system, technological, feasible. It would be much safer. And the central banks themselves are unwilling to entertain this. This is not only the Fed, this is the BIS, this is the ECB. None of them will touch that. Right? That tells you how deeply entrenched the system is. We're franchised the money making or the money issuance to private banks and allowed them to make a lot of money along the way and have stabilized them by using public resources to bail them out in times of crisis. And you can imagine that they will not be very happy if they will be pushed out of that system. But it's not happening. And I don't think it will happen without that kind of a crisis, unfortunately. On ESG, I'm a skeptic. I think that's increasingly obvious. One doesn't have to talk too much about it. I think there was a lot of greenwashing going on. ESG is such a fuzzy term that nobody knows what it is, and everybody can somehow associate something with it. And I think there was more, again, sort of advertising, just nice talk, than anything real. And in particular, when you think about green finance, I think it was used as a new asset class that you create. I wrote an op-ed last fall about the myth of green capitalism, and then I taught a seminar in the spring on law and finance on green finance, and I told my students to basically prove me wrong. Read the op-ed, you all get case studies, work on green bonds and ESG and offsetting assets, whatever it is, just prove me wrong. I don't think they have. I just don't think that within the capitalist system we can make a true transition to greening. It's just contradictory to the way the system has been set up, or what the system is.
Hi, I'm Johnny Hardman, University of Edinburgh. Thank you very much for an excellent talk. As a company lawyer, it highlighted how the finance side, and especially the shadow banking system, has exposed issues in company law, especially with the willingness to acknowledge perhaps an artificial level of leverage by lending at different levels. But I wondered, is the problem that between the kind of legal fragmentation, is the problem with it more principled in that there's an issue between when company law lets the firm fragment in that way, or is the problem merely that finance has interacted with this fragmentation to create a systemic risk? Is there a more principled objection, or is it just the way things played out?
Yeah. So I find it hard to both ask the question and answer to them that economists like Oliver Hart ask is what is the optimal, where's the boundary of the firm? What is the optimal allocation of control rights over certain pools of assets? That is an interesting question to answer. You could ask for my talk, what is the optimal level of legal fragmentation within a single business, right? I find it difficult to give an answer, and I probably wouldn't ask the question because I can see that fragmentation can be used for all kinds of different purposes. So it's not just sort of there's an optimal level, but you can say, so for certain kinds of issues, it's a real good choice, right? So if you want to have a subsidiary that does something different from all the other subsidiaries and has a certain risk profile, to separate it from the rest and to say you just raise your own at least debt finance, we control you from above, but you also have your own board, etc. That seems to be making sense. You can ask why don't you spin it off in like an Oliver Hart sense? Why is it still part of this business? But there might be synergies that. So it would be very fact specific, where I would say this is not a bad thing. But I think where sort of I stop having sympathy for that is that if these vehicles are nothing but legal shells, and I think in the financial sector and increasingly in some of the corporate structures that we're seeing, they're just nothing but legal shells for particular financialization activities, don't do anything else. I don't think that's the purpose of corporate law, and I think it's an abuse of a particular corporate form. I should just add something else that we discussed before we came to the talk. What I find interesting when you look at the just evolution of corporate law over time, we have stripped any connectivity of the corporate form to real business out of corporate law, right? There's no business purpose in any corporate certificate anymore. Delaware started this in the US in the 1920s, that it was fine to just write anything that is legal we can do, right? And not only us. So on that plus sort of being able to set up subsidiaries. It used to be that you had to have a business purpose for a merger. Nobody asked for a business purpose for a merger anymore. This is just all this inefficient stuff that we can't really easily adjudicate. So we take all these more fuzzy standards that the law actually did have and probably had for very good reasons out of the law, and all of a sudden just becomes an instrument for particular structures. And I think then it's at that stage, it's very hard to distinguish, when is it really used for something good and when is it just a strategy for enriching some people who know how to use it.
Hi, my name is Mariana Armengol. Sorry.
Go ahead. No,
you go.
Okay. I'm an LLM student here at LSE. Actually, you already answered my question because I was thinking about that diversification, and it's okay to diversify from a business point of view, to diversify the risk and so on. So just a quick comment / question. Looking at this web of subsidiaries and these group strategies to limit the liability and use the subsidiaries as the ATMs, as you mentioned. Do you have any clue how we can change these structures? How can ideally replace? Of course, assuming that there is will and no lobbying and so on. It's just an ideal situation, but just trying to think or rethink about these structures that we've been using for a long time. Thank you.
Yeah, I think what you want to do is you want to make the more, let's say, abusive or the just money minting vehicles more costly for those who set them up, right? So you could either ask that you, for a specific business purpose, otherwise you will look through the form and you hold the entire entity, not only the parent, but all subsidiaries liable as well. So basically you say we will respect the corporate form only if we do find something real beyond the ITM thing. So that would allow you to say, for business diversification reasons, we don't only want to diversify inside an legally integrated firm, but we use a subsidy. That's fine. But if it's only basically this other activity, then one could set aside the corporate form. That would basically make people think twice how easily to use them. So I think it's just an example now on the top of my head, but that's the way I would think about this, how to make it costly to use this for this as a simple tool for financialization purposes. And it's not just saying this has to have a business purpose that's hard to monitor and to adjudicate, but you could say, and if it doesn't, then there is liability of the group for everything that happens here. And that sort of creates a different incentive structure, I think, ex ante for setting them up.
Hi, Alex Neuber. I started out with Katharina 30 years ago, but I then went into practice mostly. I came from the economic side to law economics, and of course I'm a big reader of hers. But I think that two comments I'd like to make. One, I think, of course, you're discussing, as befits a systemic risk conference, the pathological side of legalized, what do you call it, fragmentation. If there are whole reams of the real economy which wouldn't function if you had an ability to create SPVs, to create independent power plants, to create public partnerships, to create pools of asset classes where individual investors and lenders can provide money. And so I'm happy that you said at the end, Katharina, a little bit, of course, you're discussing the post-Lehman and the pathological end of also what is a flood of money in the United States and maybe under-regulation there, I think. But there are many jurisdictions all over the world, including in continental Europe and elsewhere, where if you didn't have the ability to create individual legal entities to create financial structures and attract pools of money, you couldn't actually build a lot of real economy. Call it now renewables, right? You want to create a solar panel or you want to create a new wind farm, you have to have SPVs where you get debt investors coming in, you have equity, you have off-takes to utilities. If you didn't have those legal structures through a separate legal entity, you couldn't do that. You have the same in many other areas. And so, and the other thing is again, the availability of debt. I think it's been talked about in very negative terms in this talk. You look around the world, and most countries have a dearth of capital, right? I mean, there are a few rich countries that are part of the OECD. That's 26 countries out of 150. There are many others, including some of which I had the pleasure of working in. And these people need access to capital. And so if you can create corporate structures that will attract pools of capital and long-term pools of capital, that's a positive. So I think one should not, in this whole debate, forget that if we throw out the baby with the bathwater and we kill legal fragmentation because we take legal forms away, these legal forms enable a lot of positive growth and real businesses. And just to your last point there about, legal codes no longer being part of registration in Delaware, if you want to create any company in the European Union, you have to go for the EU code and to write exactly in which sector you're active and what you have to do. So I think there are degrees of fallibility of regulators and susceptibility to lobbying. Another point that I think the US is probably among the extremes of those countries, but I think we should give credit to some jurisdictions which are maybe doing a slightly better job in not allowing these pathologies to develop as much as you've analyzed so well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think interesting question, of course, is whether we could do real good stuff without the financial structures as they are. And I think I would simply doubt that assumption. Just because we have created these financial structures and they fund solar business is not that's the only way that we can fund solar business. I think that case would have to be made. There are probably alternatives. We could think about all kinds of things from public investment structures that would co-finance. You don't have to have public investment only in PPP forms that take a particular structure. I think that has a lot to do with the ways in which the financial system has evolved and that has been facilitated by particular legal structures, but that's not the only way in which we could do this. Similarly, with emerging markets or developing countries' access to finance, there's never gone away, that problem. Right? Since colonization and before, we always say they need access to finance. We invent all kinds of new ways in which they should have access to finance. It turns out they never get all the access of finance because I think the imbalance also geopolitically speaks a little bit that in the direction that this is not necessarily a development tool, but it's also, of course, in capitalist economies, not surprisingly, a profit-making tool. And yes, many countries have basically created some SPVs to access international capital markets and do dollar funding. Then you bring dollar funding in these countries, the dollar rate, exchange rate changes, and then they tank. So these are also not unambiguously positive type of vehicles that were beneficial for these countries. But I think we have to look at the investor side and the country side at the same time and think about what real alternatives would be. And overall on debt, I think debt is at least 5,000 years old, as David Gerber said. But I think we are, at a level where we live with levels of debt at the household, the corporate, the financial, the state level that you have to think about whether that is appropriate, especially also in the moment that we find ourselves. And we talked a lot about at the conference about climate change. If you do debt finance, you always have to make the assumption that the future looks somewhat better, at least as good as the present, right? Otherwise, you can't do debt finance. And so within the animal spirit of Keynes, says, yeah, let's just do it because we will invest and there will be returns. If we all know that the future doesn't look as good as the present, we have to think very hard about how much we can rely on debt finance, I think.
So yeah, let me thank you very much for your lecture and also for answering all our questions. And thank you very much to the audience for coming tonight. So thank you, Katharina.